Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delay. I got my wires crossed. I thought Johanna was the host and I was. So
Sorry about that. No, you can make me a host now and I can get the interpreter set up.
Okay, great.
I'm going to drop the agenda in the chat while people get on. Why can't I click that?
Johanna, you're all set, right?
How many people should be on this call from the meeting invite, Johanna?
We have 19 yeses.
Okay, so maybe another minute or so, Susan. Okay.
Yeah, it looks like we have 17 people. So might be okay to start.
I think so.
Yeah. So it's, oh, here comes Julie.
So we dropped the agenda in the chat, and you can pull that up on your own screen if you'd like. And what we are going to do today, the first hour, we are going to debrief out each of our group's works. So we have the childcare work group, and then we also have the small business and nonprofit work. And we each have a slide deck that we'll go through so we can all learn about what we've been up to for the last week and a half or so. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about decisions that we have to make, the process going forward, and anything else that comes up in this hour together. So without further ado, I turn it over to Susan to tee off for the childcare work group.
Rebecca, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen?
I see your screen. It looks great.
Awesome. Great. Well, it's great to see everyone, and heard some updates of the other group. I'm just so excited by the work that's been happening the last couple of weeks, and just a ton of appreciation again for everyone who's been a part of this work thus far. So I think for people who were in the nonprofit small business group, you may remember we didn't have many people who signed up for the childcare group who were from this group. We had Jorge, Julie, and I, and then Daphne as staff support were the main people in that group. So we got some awesome suggestions from people for additional members who had childcare expertise to join this group. We had a great turnout. We had about 12 additional people who were involved either behind the scenes or in the meetings. We had 2 meetings, and I'll share with you who those people were, just so you can see what the full group looked like. And again, we'd love to hear from people who were not involved with this, if there's anyone that you feel like we're missing, and especially as we share what our initial recommendations are on how to move forward. So when I talk about additional consultants, Terry, Matt, and Melanie the three of them were not involved with the work groups. Terry and Matt weren't able to make the meetings, but I'm actually meeting with them separately tomorrow to give them information in detail about our recommendations and get their feedback that was recommended from the group. And then Commissioner Locheman had recommended I reach out to Melanie, who is the executive director with Family Village. And I had a great conversation with her. I'm going to be sending out information that she sent to me, some possible directions we could go with them to the child care group and get their feedback. So just, again, really want to support transparency of this process, and make sure that people know all of the conversations that are happening behind the scenes as well. So just to review, these are the 4 areas that we started with. We reviewed these 4 kind of main buckets of work around childcare. One being expanding our contracting for slots for CCAP, and then also potentially direct financial assistance just to CCAP families, or to families that aren't qualifying for CCAP. Direct financial assistance for families to access eligible FFN providers, and then some type of guaranteed basic income transfer for low-income families with children 0 to 5. The second one was funding for childcare professionals. So it was really around that recruitment and retention area. The third one is funding for nonprofits to specifically cover childcare for staff and clients and families. And then the fourth idea, which came from the group, was really around a policy change. It was changing the Colorado State Constitution to age 0 to grade 12 for free, appropriate public care and education. So that's what we started with. Our next step before our second meeting was to survey the group to see if we could narrow the focus. And what came up from that survey is there was really an interest in focusing on the family, friends, and network childcare, and then also the direct assistance. So we talked quite a bit about that during the second meeting. What we were able to do was eliminate the Colorado statute or the Constitution change, just because it doesn't really fit under the ARPA guidelines very well around hiring lobbyists or paying for policy. So we eliminated that from our list. We did a Jamboard activity using several of the questions from our criteria checklist to start to get people to think through what are the areas we really think meet all this criteria, where are there potential overlaps here, where are there places that we could leverage, where are there places that there's other resources coming in from the state or the feds that we want to avoid duplication. So we had a process with the group where everyone contributed to that. And where we landed was our recommended focus area, kind of I would say top focus area. And this doesn't mean that this is our only focus area at this point, but is looking at direct assistance to families. The group really came to consensus that by providing direct assistance to families, that would support many of our goals. It would provide families options to use money for outside childcare. It could support childcare centers and FFNs because that money would end up going to them. And maybe even for some families, it could help support a parent to stay home with an infant. What we talked about a little bit was different ways to do this. And one of the options we discussed is, potentially following something like the child tax credit. Leslie had shared with us that in order for us to do any kind of guaranteed income or direct support, it really has to follow already existing guidelines around this. We can't decide to give $2 million to one family, for example. And so one of the options that we could follow is to follow the child tax credit amount, which is the $300 per month per child. And just, we also wanted to be realistic about how far this money would really go, how many families it would serve. So if we were looking at this, allocating $7.5 million For direct assistance to families, this would reach 2,083 families with one child for a year. We also discussed the issue which has come up before around, by giving families direct assistance like this, it could potentially cause a cliff effect where we are putting a family at risk of them not being eligible for benefits. And so there are ways around this. Julie was great at helping. They're doing a lot of this through EFA, helping to for us to understand different avenues that we could take to avoid this. And one being that if the money was going to be used for childcare, then we could potentially give money to FRCs who could pay the providers directly for that. There was also some advocacy for us to not dictate how the money is spent. I think from a couple of the people on the call that really wanting to support and trust families to use the money that they get in the way that they feel is best for their own family. So not dictating again what that money is used for. And then some other kind of potential areas we talked about is, how do we narrow down the scope? Obviously there are so many families in need. We know that this money cannot reach every single family that's in need, but could we potentially focus the direct assistance for families with kids age 0 to 3 or 0 to 5 and target neighborhoods with higher social vulnerability scores? And so our group has taken a quick look at some of the GIS heat maps, the geographic heat maps, and those were able to look at neighborhoods that have higher social vulnerability scores. And if this larger group is interested in that, we certainly can make a plan for sending that out, sending that information out to the larger group. I'm going to pause there and see if there's any additional things I'm forgetting at this point from Debbie, Julie, Jorge. Anything I'm missing? Any additions to this?
I think you did an excellent job capturing all of it. So,
all right. So these are some other areas for consideration. We did have, some of the things we struggled with a bit were we can give direct assistance to families, but if we don't help support some stability in the workforce, we're not going to have the slots available in childcare. So that was one of the things we talked about. There was
the Spanish translator in the English channel.
I'm sorry?
We're good now.
Okay, sorry about that. So there was some advocacy for us to provide some professional development dollars for childcare workers who are working within the family, friends, and neighbors childcare centers, or settings, I should say. So that's one of the things I think we'd still like to explore. And then the other piece, which the group really wasn't involved in that conversation, again, it was an interest or suggestion from Commissioner Locheman, is potentially to invest in a pilot with family villages or other models that have drop-in where we really can address the gap that we see for slots for infants and toddlers. And so Shannon Bryan, who is another staff person with Boulder County, is on the call today, and I've asked her to do a little bit of research just on any similar models that we might have in Boulder County to family villages or any other drop-in centers that we could focus on that could potentially fill that gap. So these are some other things that have come up since we had our meeting on Monday. And I just talked about this a little bit, the need for childcare workforce recruitment. Again, it's not going to do people any good if there are any slots for people to go to. And, we haven't narrowed down exactly how we want the population we want to focus on, but I think the question has come up is, the idea of having a transformational idea, and could we really reduce the number of families that we're supporting, but increase the amount of assistance for those families over a longer period of time? The other thing that came up for us was it feels really important to be able to provide services for these families, to make sure that we're really looking at the full continuum of social determinants of health. We also know that there's all of these home visitation, universal home visitation services. Could we potentially make sure that those are connected into any type of direct assistance? And there's an opportunity for families to take advantage of those services as well. And then the other thing I'll add that I didn't put up here is that we did get an overview of the state funding that's coming down for child care centers. And there's quite a bit. I think many of you probably saw that just a couple days ago, the RFP came out for the Circles grants from the governor's office that child care centers can apply for. So I think we felt that there is a lot, I wouldn't say a lot, there's other opportunities for funding to come into child care centers. And so we wanted to be able to focus on this direct assistance, FFN, and then filling some of these gaps around slots for infants and toddlers. And then some of this is just repeat. They're just kind of questions that we have around determining the criteria for payments. How do we evaluate the impact here? And then a question I think for the other group is, will the small business and nonprofit subgroup be providing funding to child care centers to support with workforce issues? So that was one of the things that I think our group wanted to understand a bit better. So I will just open it up for Julie, Debbie, and Jorge. Is Jorge on? Let's see him. To add any comments, anything I missed. Thumbs up from Julie. Okay. Any questions or comments from the group, the larger group? Hayden.
I have a couple of questions. If I'm just really curious, I don't know, I'm going to be aware of time, but if you could briefly explain what the Family Villages model is, as someone who's not in childcare, that'd be really cool. And then the second question was, I guess, around the workforce concern too. I was curious to know if, even with that state funding, if the childcare workforce concern is still like a big flag for y'all.
Yeah, so I can answer the first question, and I might look to Debbie for the second question if she has insight on that. Or so the Family Villages model is a kind of community-based model, really intended to support not only the child care challenges that parents have, but be able to build some community for parents. So it's I don't want to call it a co-op model as much, but it really is a space for parents to come and collaborate and work on site, but also get childcare there. It's a drop-in, so there are no issues with kind of age or slots necessarily. It's a more affordable option for parents. Parents do need to stay on site, but there's separate areas. Obviously, there's childcare staff there. And then the parents have different working spaces. So if they have a job that's a remote job, they can go there and work and have childcare for their kids. It has attracted a lot of women, mostly, who are looking to start a small business, have a small business, want to connect with other people. They've also described it as really, the feedback they've gotten is it's been also mental health support for the parents, because there can be such an isolating factor of having small children for parents. And so there's that connection with other parents. For 60 hours a month, it's $560. So I think a more affordable option for childcare. And they have one site in East Boulder right now, and they're looking to open a site in Lafayette and Longmont soon. And then as far as the grants coming from the state, I don't really have a kind of a fiscal assessment of how much it's really going to help support recruitment and retention of childcare workers. I would say none of this, the money is never enough, but maybe would ask Debbie if she has a sense of how far those funds will go.
Yeah, I know they just opened up the Circle Grant RFP, so we're still diving a little bit deeper too into this to really do some financial modeling to see what is this really going to look like and what can the impact of that be. So maybe what we can do is find out more information about that. I hate to give wrong information. So I will say every bit does help. Though I think considering that there's some changes in licensing and pieces that they're looking at more qualifications for early childcare providers, that's creating some challenges of like how do existing childcare providers who do not have degrees, what does that look like in terms of getting them the education and training needed to be able to do that. So it's kind of interesting because we have a couple of things working at the same time. There are obviously some national legislation that's looking at this as well. And that is somewhat more focused on the actual teachers and providing some dollars for career development and bonuses, but I've not seen anything obviously finalized on that. So sorry for not being able to provide a little more information, but.
The other thing I'll add is that I'm in close touch with the city of Boulder, who's doing a guaranteed income pilot through ARPA, as all of you know from the first kickoff day for our work here, to ensure that we're not going to overlap with them if we do decide to go in that direction, or if it is approved by the commissioners that we go in that direction. So that will all be work that we'll do during the deeper dive planning period. Right, if there's no other questions or comments, I turn it over to Rebecca. And again, if there are, just don't hesitate to email me or with any suggestions or thoughts. Really appreciate any input.
Okay, you guys can see my screen?
Yep.
All right, I very quickly put together a slide deck once I heard Susan was going to do one. So I welcome my group to jump in at any point to expand on any of these slides. So our group has titled our project Community Revitalization Through Equitable Investments in People and Places. So our process began with collapsing the small business nonprofit support section of our ideas spreadsheet with workforce sustainability. And as we started talking through the problems and some of the ideas that were on that spreadsheet, it became clear that a lot of the ideas and problems that we were trying to solve, they weren't really specific only to the nonprofit community or only to the small business community. So concerns about workforce stabilization, vacancies, taking care of our staff, recruitment, ways to invest in the business, all of those problems and challenges belong to both. And so we decided to, rather than create two tracks, try to work to have an umbrella category, which is community revitalization through equitable investments in people and places, and then the path to that be applicable to both nonprofits and small businesses that fit within an established set of criteria. And finally, what we discovered and realized as we went along in our discussions is that we wanted to honor the small business and the nonprofits' ability to be flexible and invest in the ways that they know they need investing in order to stabilize their business, whether it's primarily around the workforce, whether it's infrastructure, whatever the issue is, that this opportunity needs to be flexible enough while advancing equity initiatives. So the summary of community revitalization through equitable investment in people and places is that this will target low-wage workers, remote locations, and historically underserved and underrepresented communities, with an infusion of public monies to address the disproportionate impact of COVID-19. The eligible small businesses and nonprofit organizations will have the opportunity to make the short-term and long-term investments that will allow them to stabilize their workforces while advancing racial equity initiatives. So that's the high level concept. So we have lots of goals and objectives tied to this idea. We want small businesses and nonprofits to receive these dollars through a grant. We want these grants need to advance racial and economic equity, yet be flexible enough for the small business and nonprofit to invest in the area they believe will have the greatest impact. So we don't want to be overly prescriptive. And then through an administratively simple but effective set of success metrics, we'll have the ability to report back on greatest impact. Those greatest impact outcomes, we'll need some work in developing what that looks like so that it both is the right one, is effective, it's accurate, but it's also administratively simple to implement. There's an asterisk at the bottom that there may be additional work required to reduce the number of eligible small businesses and nonprofits so that this work is administratively manageable, so we don't have to add Boulder County staff, but also so that the grant amounts are meaningful, that they're materially large enough to be meaningful. And that sort of gets back to, I think, a comment Susan made at the end of her slide deck, which was, every bit helps, but is it necessary to try to narrow the scope so that the amounts are impactful? That's not something that we as a group really had the chance to dig into, but it's something that as a subgroup, that maybe as a team today, we can have a larger conversation. So what does it mean, these underrepresented and underserved communities? We wanted to get very specific. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So small businesses with a particular emphasis on those owned by historically underserved and underrepresented communities. Small businesses geographically located in a zip code below the poverty level. Small businesses that have not received any COVID-19 relief funding. Nonprofits serving communities hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, low-wage workers, remote communities, and vulnerable retail sales districts. So underrepresented and underserved communities include this list. So low to medium income communities, communities of color, indigenous people, those who speak languages other than English, people with disabilities and chronic conditions, older adults, young children, people with criminal records, LGBTQ, and refugees and immigrants. This slide is a snapshot of examples of how grant proposals can zoom in on ideas that advance racial and economic inequities, while also investing in their businesses as well as their workforces. This is certainly not an all-inclusive list, but it is a list that we've started to bring some visibility into what we're trying to accomplish here. So proposals could be around DEI trainings that help grow organizational awareness of systems that perpetuate disadvantage. Proposals could increase wages and recognition bonuses for specifically employees below $25 an hour. Physical upgrades of storefronts. Expanding legal resources for immigrants and undocumented workers. So for instance, if a business is trying to hire individuals who don't yet have the ability to legally work, could we invest some legal resources into that organization to help make that process happen faster? Retention bonuses for under-resourced small businesses and nonprofits, employee wellness benefits that encourage rest and healing from vicarious trauma sustained by being a frontline worker, staff development training to help create income earning potential and career progression, hiring staff who are representative of program service and or disproportionately impacted community members, language translation and interpretation services, cultural broker services, funding and technical assistance to support historically underserved entrepreneurs and small business owners, and consulting services to help the small business and or nonprofit achieve sustainable growth and address vulnerabilities. So when we think about how this work can be transformational, these are some of the things that have bubbled up to the surface for us. The first is this group has talked about the appointment of a selection committee. And the selection committee would be made up of a diverse group of community members who go through rigorous equity training. And they could potentially be involved in the development or further development of the criteria for this grant proposal. They would also be involved, more importantly, or most importantly, in the process of selecting which proposals move forward. And the inspiration and energy around this idea is really to get the equity work across the finish line. We're doing all this work on the front end, we're understanding the problem, we're trying to develop ideas through the lens of equity, and now let's make the decision through that lens as well. And so the selection committee could be a way to make sure that that happens, and that could be really transformational. Specifically, you know, grant programs are not new, original, or sexy ideas, but they're important and they're necessary. And the grant criteria could be the place where this is transformational, meaning that we are zooming in really closely on the parts of the community that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. Another way this could be transformational is that the winners of the awards could be paired with cultural brokers and business coaches to help implement their ideas, understand business vulnerabilities, and otherwise further invest in the business. And then also, very importantly, we learned in the phase one of all of this that from the community that a lot of people don't know about the programs that are available to them, or how to find them, how to access them. So let's not repeat that problem with the rollout of this or any of the things that we do in the conclusion of our work together. Let's make sure that the marketing and the outreach to get people's input is just as aggressive and thorough and thoughtful on the other side in implementing the things that we do. And then in close, similar to the question, as I mentioned earlier, that Susan putting in front of us is, are we transformational enough with this idea? Have we gotten clear enough on who we're trying to serve, how we are going to do it, or are we too broad and we risk essentially watering down the money so much that it's not going to make a transformational impact? I think these are really important questions that we have to discuss as a team, both as subgroups and of course as a global team as well, and the economic development group. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oopsie daisy. And while I do that, I invite anybody on my team to please jump in and add anything that I've missed. Okay, well, I made this slide deck in like 25 minutes, so don't be shy, jump in. Otherwise, question, comments?
I just have one question.
Yes.
And first of all, thank you. And for making something in 25 minutes, that's incredible. So I know who I'm going to call next time I need to do that. One of the questions I had, and I know it came up in our group too, is really how we scope and scale the dollars. So I was just curious a little, one, about what we think maybe that range could look like. And it sounds like there's still conversation happening about that. The other thing is, and I know this gets challenging, I do sometimes worry if we make the process too complicated, you know, like that there's a grant process and then there's this, and I don't know if it might even be worth considering to have a coach or somebody that's helping people prepare grants. I just feel like, especially when we're thinking about equity and underserved communities. Anyway, I would just hate to put up too many barriers. So, but yet I understand there needs to be a process. So,
Yeah, I don't know what the right answer is, although I will say the Boulder County staff are getting me in touch with some people who were involved in the first round of grants going out. And I'm hoping to learn from them what worked and what didn't, and see if there's ways that we can do things different or better this time around. And then as far as scope, that's a hard question. One of the questions that we have still in our criteria document is we don't know how many people this captures or how many businesses yet, because the funnel is pretty broad, but not at the same time. And then in terms of impactful grant amounts, I think that's going to really range depending on what your P&L is, right? If you're an itty bitty $200,000 shop versus your 20 million, that's totally different. Your workforce issues are so different, yet they're equally as important. The cost, I mean. So I don't have a good answer for that. We need more time. Gosh. Well, if there are no other questions or comments, we are running ahead of schedule, which is always exciting because that leaves us more time to actually work together. Susan, do you want to just keep going until 2 before we take a break, or what do y'all want to do? I think keep going.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's great.
Okay. How about we update the group on the conversation from this morning? Start there, or unless you want to start someplace else. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds great. Do you want me to do that?
Sure, take it away.
Okay, so as I think all of you know, the steering committee meets every Thursday morning at 8, and the last couple meetings, we have done updates from each of the 3 groups, housing, the mental health and social resilience, and then our group as well. So each of the groups provided some detailed updates on their proposals or their initial recommendations and where they've kind of narrowed down those ideas. So we did a round of that with questions. There were questions from, I think, Amy, who's on right now, and Commissioner Locheman, just around kind of how is this different from what's already happening? Is it transformational? So just letting this group know that, you know, as we know from our criteria, that's a focus, but that had come up this morning as well. And then we talked about next steps, which we'll talk about a bit more, but we talked about kind of our timeline, what's coming up, what to expect, kind of the milestones between now and May 3rd, when we will be presenting to the commissioners. And in full transparency, I had horrible internet this morning. I live up in Netherlands, and when I lose my internet, I have to get in the car and drive down the road to get my cell phone to work. So that's what I had to do. So I missed probably about 10 minutes of the meeting this morning. So I'm not sure what else you would want to add, Rebecca, to that.
What I would add is that we have a due date of April 8th of finalizing our proposal to turn it over to Boulder County staff for further development and work over the next few weeks. We also talked about using some of the time over the next few Thursdays to develop the presentation that would be in front of the commissioners. We talked about the desire, the really strong desire to have the presentation represented and led by people other than Susan and I. So you all hear that? We need people to help us present this work to the Boulder County Commissioners in May. It can't just be Susan and I. So be thinking about if you're somebody who wants to play ball and help us stand up in front of the commissioners and present our idea. That would be really helpful. I'm trying to think. Johanna, you're on the call. Is there anything else that I missed as far as like deliverable dates and next steps? Susan and I missed, or we covered it all?
I think you covered just about everything. The only thing I might add is also in those weeks, if you have an expressed interest of being someone that the county staff can call on to return to follow-up questions as they're going through this. I'm sure there will be questions that need clarification. If you are at capacity at this point and need a break from the whole process, that also is completely understandable. So just if you want to communicate that to Susan or Rebecca, you know, how you want to stay involved and to what extent you can in the next weeks. It's not going to be standardized meetings or anything like that, but just to be in, you know, an additional sounding board when needed.
Very good. Any questions about the process before we move on to the next items? Okay. So a couple of things that I think we should spend some time talking about. The first is there any overlap between the recommendations of the child care group and the community revitalization projects that we want to address and clarify?
I think the one question our group had for the nonprofit small business group was, and I'm hearing maybe this detail hasn't been worked out, but will there be any specific investments in childcare centers or kind of the family, friends, and neighbors? I think that was one of the areas that we weren't sure about, because one of the suggestions that we had was to provide funding for nonprofit workers and clients for childcare. You know, I think in some ways through our proposal for direct assistance, we have the nonprofit clients or the people that nonprofits serve covered, but not necessarily the workers in nonprofits. So I think that was one of the areas that we saw a connection, a potential, not an overlap, I think just a potential connection in the work.
So the proposal as it stands does identify low-wage workers, which childcare workers can be, and young children as part of underrepresented groups. And so if a small business that is a childcare center is applying for a grant opportunity, I think it would fall within the parameters of this project. We haven't excluded them.
Great.
I didn't hear any other areas of potential overlap that we needed to clarify, but about other people in the room. Okay, well, that was quite simple. I'm just looking at the notes here. Do we want to spend some time talking about the idea of an appointed selection committee? I'm curious how the childcare group, what the childcare group thinks about that idea, either or both for the community revitalization project, and I'm wondering if it has a role in the childcare effort as well. So again, the concept of an appointed selection committee of diverse community members who go through rigorous equity training and they understand the scope of this project would help further shape the selection criteria, and then as well select the people who are receiving the awards at the other side.
I'm wondering, Rebecca, I'm just looking at the agenda, just I'm wondering if we could go back just really quick, and sorry about this, I missed it when we were looking at it. I wonder if we could just do a round robin with everyone to just hear from people how the ideas, because you're hearing about different ideas, how they're landing with people, and if there is a feeling that some or all of this is potentially transformational for our community, kind of, I wonder if that would be okay just to, before we go to the selection committee question.
I think that's a great idea. I skipped over that part. Thanks.
So just would love to hear from everybody. Kind of how do these ideas land with you? And the transformational question, you know, what does it feel like this could potentially be transformational? Jessica, do you want to start? I saw you put your camera on.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I continue to struggle with the idea that direct assistance to individuals can be transformational when it has an expiration date. I think, you know, a permanent UBI program or a permanent tax credit has, and we've seen on a short-term basis, in particular with the childcare tax credit or childcare tax credit, that that does have the opportunity to be transformational, but that if and when it ends, the transformation goes back. So that's the one concern I have there. And then I'm a huge fan of the Family Village Co-op and that concept. They used to be in Longmont, now they're in Niwot. The one thing that I would say though is, for the most part, individuals that have the opportunity to work remotely and stay with their children during that time that they're working remotely are probably not of greatest need. So when I think about like frontline workers as likely being in the greatest need just based on socioeconomics, those aren't people that can, you know, kind of stay with their kids and work remotely. And so while I appreciate and support and think the concept is fantastic, I'm not sure that that serves folks with the greatest need relative to childcare.
Thanks, Jessica. All great points. And yeah, that was one of the things that I talked with Family Village around, is what is the demographic that they're seeing. And, you know, they did say it hasn't attracted, and understandably, people who are lower income, and would it if there were scholarships opportunities? I don't know the answer to that. So thanks so much. Who would like to go next? Julie, pick on you.
Sure, I can dive in. I could see how it doesn't seem like a year or 2 year, 3 year payment stream to families would be transformational. But I just want to suggest looking at it a different way. First of all, it is where the greatest need is for most vulnerable kids in this community at 0 to 5, low income, and childcare. I mean, it's just been highly impacted by COVID. So I want to just put that out there. But also, I do think that if we do this in an intentional way with good impact evaluations, that, you know, we build the case for focusing economic supports on that level. We're in a well-resourced community, and just looking at some of the experiences we've had, like with the City of Boulder on Keep Families Housed, just showing what that does to families. It can build sustainability to move resources into that area. And it's not lost in the sense that, you know, for those years, those children would have been to childcare they wouldn't have probably been able to access otherwise. And so just like I have a little different view on that. And I find I struggle with what is transformational, and, you know, is this really ever enough money to be transformational? But I think proving the case of something can be transformational. I like the idea of the grant. I don't know if it's just general comments, but I like the idea of the grant program. It's the first time I've heard, you know, hearing the others group side. I think it's really creative. I don't see the same application to Rebecca's question on would you need a screening thing to choose families and whatnot, because that's a different kind of interface with families that's in the community, as opposed to having a group picking families to get that. I would say the question that you asked, Rebecca, is would it be the same instrument? I think it'd be very different instruments. You kind of want to have a program wrap around families that are engaging on that front, as opposed to like a competitive grant process. But yeah, I think both sound exactly like what our community needs. So I'm in favor of moving on with details.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, and I just want to add on our group, the family, friends, and neighbors was there and helping, childcare centers. And so I think there was the attention to both the demand and the supply side for childcare.
Thanks, Julie. Hayden, do you want to add anything?
I mean, I can jump in. I kind of second Julie's point. I was really excited about the childcare groups, like money for families. And I think that also makes sense because then that money goes to pay for childcare, and that would hopefully support the workforce too, right? And some of at least the pilots that have happened around guaranteed income have even only been a few years, but like the Mayors for Guaranteed Income Project shows that even in a couple year pilot programs that they have been pretty transformational for those communities. So, and that they work. So I feel like that is the right step in terms of also like what is transformational is a great question, and like it does seem like a good step in that direction. A curiosity, I guess, is how to reconcile that piece around like giving it with no restrictions and like the cliff effects. And so I heard y'all said you talked about it, but I'm really curious about what that looks like in a more detailed way. And I think I do still like have questions about whether our group has like that's transformational, the grant program. We talked about it so much, and I think just still lingering questions around how to like scope it in a way that's really targeted towards like workforce support and also doesn't get too diluted is still just really lingering in my mind, and that feels like the place to narrow in on in terms of like transformation, I guess, or something closer to that. So that's still my lingering, like I kind of go back and forth depending on the moment. So, but I also agree. I think we're kind of on the right track.
Great, thanks, Hayden. Berenice, you put something in the chat. Do you want to share?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Susan. I think I'm talking just about the friends, neighbors, and family childcare centers. I think related to transformational, this assistant can help them to formalize they have to process and get registered with the state, get online, marketing strategies. If they want to move from their place to rent a space, that could also help them. But these businesses are always in need, and we may not see it right now, but we may see it in the future.
Great, thanks. Rachel.
Thank you. I agree with the comments so far, and I'm still digesting some of the ideas too. I was excited to see the ideas that you created in the childcare group. It's exciting to me. And I think for me, my concerns are more around making sure that the programs that we do come up with are able to reach the intended audiences, and that there's support to also, as we're talking about underserved communities, helping people actually access and use the services, at least on the small business side. It takes a lot of time and extra resources when we work with folks who may be low socioeconomic status, may not have access to technology, or people who don't speak English. So those are my thoughts so far.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Debbie.
Well, I think it's really impressive how far we've gotten in a short amount of time. I think we're all struggling a little bit with this transformational piece. I think that a lot of times it's, you know, like, can we go for the sexy thing? What's the exciting thing to go for? And I guess what I would say is the areas that we're looking at, I agree with Julie, they're the ones that are needed. And I also feel like this idea of sort of how is it different or new, you know, when you start looking at building a program from the bottom up, you know, that's a lot of cost and time. So, you know, even in our group, we were trying to look at, you know, what are some of the existing systems in place that have experience with this to be able to facilitate some of that process as well. And I just think that's an important thing to keep an eye on, is that I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think it's about the impact that we're trying to make. And to Julie's point, if we can demonstrate impact and success on it, you know, how do we then leverage that to put more dollars into it? The last thing I wanted to say is that there's been so many great topics discussed because there's multiple challenges that all intertwine to what we're trying to solve. And we know this one thing will not do all of that. And so I do think it's worth capturing some of those other areas that were talked about that maybe don't fall under this funding, but that would be important to share with the commissioners, because I think it's something we have to address as a community to actually solve the problem and be transformational. So I just don't want to lose sight of those or track of those during this. I think it's a real opportunity with this incredible group of people you've had together, just to make sure.
Thanks so much for adding that, Debbie. You know, that Johanna and Amy brought that up this morning, is I think it was them, if not, I'm giving credit to them, that the idea of when we do present to the commissioners in May, that we will have our main recommendations, but also to include maybe on a final slide or something of, these are some of the other top ideas, like it didn't make it to the very top, but these are some of the things that we would have, if we'd had more money, we really would have liked to see, and we think could have a huge impact for kind of further planning in future years. So I think that's a great point. And Simon.
Thank you. Yeah, I really don't have much to add. I completely agree. And especially with Debbie's last message, this is actually the—
one moment, we're hearing the Spanish translation in the English channel. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Is that okay? Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I think Debbie's message, particularly around just the brain power and the community awareness that was part of both of these groups, these are the things that we should be focused on. And I've struggled with the concept of how transformational to be from the beginning of that being put out there as one of the expectations. I think it's appropriately transformational. And I think by investing in the areas that our community needs best, I think it's just important to remember that all of the downstream impact is extraordinarily transformational for the targeted people we're trying to serve by this. And that's an important component too.
Thanks, Simon. I think that's everyone from the group. So thanks, Rebecca, for letting us just do that little round robin just to see where everyone's at. So, and I know we wanted to pick up on the groups. You were asking about the advisory groups.
Yes, do you want to take a quick 5-minute, 10-minute break? It's at 2 o'clock.
What do people think? Do you want to keep going or take a break?
Thumbs up if you want to take a break, thumbs down if you don't. Okay, we're taking a break. Let's take a 10-minute break. All right, come back at 2:11. Got a chance to get a break. Looks like Simon had to drop off, and Denise is going to drop off. So I think we were going to step into the discussion about selection committee. So it'd be great to hear from everyone. I think Julie already commented, she didn't think it might not be the best fit for childcare for the reasons that she described. I'd like to hear from other people on the idea for either group that has some validity to it or some concerns that you might have. Is this a transformational piece that we should really be highlighting? We'd like your feedback from the broader group. I already know what Hayden think and Rachel because they're in our group. Debbie, thank you.
Sure. I think that for the childcare, I agree. I think that we should probably use a different process because we are looking at distributing funds in a certain way to a large group of individuals based on criteria. But I like the idea that with the other group really focusing with a group of nonprofit and corporations of what that looks like. I also wonder sort of how you set up what the criteria is for the selection committee, and then make sure that, you know, we have that mix in that group too. That would just be, of course, that's always an important piece of that too. Again, that, you know, just always with any kind of grant process and selection process, it's just also, like I said earlier, I think making sure there aren't barriers. And if there are barriers, what are we doing to alleviate those? So I would hate for it to have unintentional consequences where we may not have people who actually apply because of that. So.
Yes, that is always the challenge. Hayden, Rachel, either of you want to chime in?
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. Just to add, kind of piggyback on what Debbie said, I think it really does depend on the criteria we come up with. I've seen or been a part of some grant programs that are a simple self-selection where the entrepreneur just says that they were impacted by COVID-19, but also on, I guess, a heavier criteria side where they may need to the small business may need to demonstrate, show their economic injury, that they actually show their loss of revenues and things like that they've experienced during COVID. But I get concerned for the reasons Debbie said. It may, when we're talking about underserved, we don't want to discourage anyone from applying. And gosh, there was something else to that and I just lost it. I'm so sorry. But we don't want to discourage anyone from applying. And if I remember my second point, I'll put it in the chat. Sorry, guys.
Thanks, Rachel. Jessica, you had your hand up next.
And I don't know, I didn't mean to do the thumbs up. I don't know how to get rid of it. So here we are. There it goes. Sorry about that. So the one thing that that I'm kind of very passionate about is, so yes, important that we're using these funds and require that we're using these funds to support individuals, organizations, that were negatively impacted by COVID. So I think certainly that would be a criteria. But for me, for the ARPA dollars, and for if we're talking about transformational, as important or potentially more important is the intended use of those dollars, investing in revitalization, whether it be of the individual organization or the area that they're in. So I would be hesitant to support something where it's just I was negatively impacted by COVID without some sort of, and this is how I can use these dollars to invest in revitalization, again, of my company or of the area that my company is located in.
Thank you. Hayden.
feel like there's a few different pieces around like the criteria for applying, and then like the selection committee, decision-making committee, if I'm understanding this conversation, or maybe I feel like I'm not totally understanding all the pieces we're talking about.
I
Is that
think they may have gotten a little bit meshed, but the question really was about the role that an appointed selection committee could play in getting these projects over the finish line in terms of the equity work.
Yeah, well, Rebecca knows my opinion, and everyone in our group does, but yeah, I'm definitely for it in terms of selection committee having some kind of decision-making power in terms of these groups, because I've been a part of grant-making committees that are very diverse, that have like really important perspectives, especially from community members who maybe aren't always given that decision-making process, who can say like, oh yeah, this organization does really important work, or have like really important perspectives on like the need from a different angle. I don't know if it necessarily has to be only community members, but I think having like a large body of community voice in that can be really helpful for making these big decisions. And I've been a part of grant making committees that I think are the opposite, where people are like, oh no, this group, this identity group is fine, you know, where like maybe they're not actually, and people don't really have that lived experience to say so. So that's why I'm usually for like a more diverse, like, and just having like, to the point around equity, like community voice in the decision-making process, I think is really important, especially when most of us like that get opportunities to make decisions aren't necessarily living the lives that the people that we're trying to serve are. I feel like if we really want to talk equity, like getting that voice in the room is so important. And then in terms of like the point around like grant barriers, I thought that was an awesome idea, Debbie, to like, I don't know how much money that would cost, but if there are supports for businesses or organizations that maybe aren't as good at writing grants, or don't have that experience, or are like smaller and maybe don't have the resources, I feel like that could really, like, that would be on the like kind of writing your proposal idea side of things, but I feel like that could really help, especially a lot of the smaller orgs, or maybe people who don't have a ton of traditional experience in that, to make it a little more equitable.
I agree. I'm glad you brought that back up, because that could be something that actually creates a meaningful flywheel for people, right? If they're given the opportunity to learn the skill, practice the skill, put it into action, then rinse and repeat however many times over the course of their career. Let's see, Susan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple things. You know, we're going to meet with the people who did the grants for the CARES Act, and I was a part of some of that, so I do know some of the lessons learned around that piece. You know, I think this is to Debbie's point. My hope is that you know, we don't overcomplicate stuff, and that that both groups are looking at new ways of reaching out to businesses, nonprofits, and individuals that we don't normally serve, or who are underserved by us. I think that I love the idea of a kind of a grant coach, because I think what we've started talking about internally within the county is equity in grant making, and how often the criteria that we have to even apply for a grant, it makes it impossible for some of these really small nonprofits that don't have the capacity to apply, or to provide the data that we're wanting, or things like that. So I've just been thinking through on our side for the childcare, especially since we can do direct cash assistance to people who are undocumented, is, you know, what are we missing as far as our outreach connection with people who may not be involved with some of our organizations? You know, how could we do this a little bit differently, just as far as a broader outreach? So that's just my 2 cents on that.
I think that brings up a good question. It might be a nice segue into another part of this conversation, which is I think that both groups have a desire to do outreach differently to make sure that the intended audiences are captured. What does that actually look like? What are we doing that doesn't work? What's missing? And those things should be built into a recommendation, right? Like actual tangible ideas. Debbie, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just thinking about even our representation in this group. And I feel like we really need cultural brokers in that discussion, because I do believe when there's trust within a community and relationships already, that may be one of the most powerful ways for us to be able to go into communities versus expecting communities to come to us. And so I was even thinking with that question, like who else needs to be around the table for that conversation for us to really be able to answer that question most effectively. So just a couple of thoughts, maybe not helpful probably, but just a few thoughts.
Nope, I think they're very helpful. Thank you. Hayden.
Yeah, second that. That's super helpful. I've been thinking about that and just thinking about like what cultural brokers and what other community-based, like community-led groups are around that have that trust established, and like also like word of like, I mean, I guess we all have we could all start getting the word out, you know, through these community-led nonprofits. We can get a lot of word out, or I guess all businesses, but word of mouth is also a really huge way that people share information, and sometimes like just putting things on the internet, you know, doesn't always work, and so like using those kind of community networks I think is going to be another important avenue.
Do we think that is a good, do we think that we should try to bring some more clarity to the how between now and May? So get in touch with these cultural brokers. Who are they? Where are they? How do we do this in the next few weeks? So that we can actually put real ideas on paper about how to do this, not just a concept.
And I'm just have a quick question. Sorry for not raising my hand. When we're talking about May 8th, and I completely get the urgency around this, and we want to be able to get the money out, but I almost wonder for the how. It almost seems like once we know what projects have been approved, then we should talk about the how, because I actually think it could be a more impactful discussion and conversation at that point, and even identifying who would be the right cultural brokers that we look at along the lines for all of the projects. And like I said, I know there's like this urgency, but some of these pieces, I feel like we have to be a little bit more cautious and pushing forward too quickly without, you know, I think you all have done a great job about trying to engage, you know, different expertise in this. But I guess I'm just wondering if a recommendation is maybe the how is how do we actually get to the how? And what does that process look like so that we can do really meaningful and impactful outreach?
Maybe, Susan, maybe you can speak to that a little bit, the process between, well, I guess after May, sort of to Debbie's question or comment, is there going to be opportunity for the how to take more shape after project selection?
Yeah, and I would, you know, Johanna can maybe jump in, or Aisa can jump in as well. But you know, I think that they want to have a good concept and make sure that we're answering the questions from the criteria the best that we can. You know, if we have information about all of those questions, that's great. That's essentially, is my understanding, what's going to be presented. That information will be presented to the commissioners. After the 3rd, there's, you know, that's when more of the detailed planning, and to your point, Debbie, the how will, some of that will happen. I do think it's important that we answer some of the big how questions. I mean, it may not be as detailed as specific outreach questions or something, but I think those questions will come up from the commissioners if they are wondering about implementation barriers. So I think some of that's still a little bit in the gray zone for me, but what we know is that the dollars need to be obligated by 2026. And that means there is still time for some additional planning and implementation phase, kind of a pre-implementation phase for some of this. So I don't think the expectation is that every question's answered around that prior to May 3rd.
I think that's absolutely right, Susan. And to add to that, the engagement team is already starting to think about what that kind of additional engagement would look like after a decision is made to fill in some of those questions that remain around implementation. So let's say, for example, just this was talked about in the meeting before with one of the other groups, figuring out if there need to be mental health resources in a certain place, going back out, talking to the community to re-identify those gaps where data might not exist. So that type of thing might need to happen again prior to those implementation pieces for your proposals. I think, Debbie, what you said about identifying maybe what those types of outreach or other steps would need to be is a great way to do it. Obviously, the engagement team is going to build off of, methods that worked really well in phase 1 and learnings from phase 1. But I think if there are other things that this group can recognize that would be really important to that, those are really important pieces to call out as well.
And so I think just as an example for the child care group, what I would like to have is details around our suggested focus population for these dollars, an estimate of how much we're wanting to provide for each family, kind of the criteria. But what I don't anticipate having or needing to have by May 3rd is the specifics of exactly how we will outreach to these families, who exactly will be involved in that, who will be kind of administering the dollars, how it'll be administered exactly. So if I'm wrong about that, and I see that Commissioner Loachman has joined us, welcome. Please jump in. But I think that's kind of the level in our conversations that I'm understanding we need to land on.
Thanks, Susan. And I apologize because I missed a little bit of what you were saying while my audio was doing something fun. Good afternoon, everybody. I apologize. I was in a public hearing that just ended, so that's why I'm running behind. But if there are specific questions, because I think I missed a little portion of that, that I can be helpful with, I'm absolutely here to do that.
I think the question was really, Commissioner, was just really about the details of the how, and I think we were just providing information that, generally speaking.
Sorry, one moment. We're hearing the Spanish translation again in the English channel.
Okay.
Thank you.
All set? So I think we were just sharing that, generally speaking, that that there will still be some implementation questions that are not answered by May 3rd. And the expectation is not to have every detail worked out by May 3rd. It's really to be able to answer those criteria, list of questions to the best of our ability. And that, some of the higher level how are we going to do this, ideas should be worked out, but very specific implementation questions is probably not enough time to figure out some of that.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. And I'll just add in for a moment. And I'm sure you've already done a ton of different conversation and work, et cetera, but just want to encourage, as you're getting to that process, and we talked about it a little bit at the steering committee this morning, about how is this work, go back to the very beginning of, and everybody, I know, especially in phase 2, you've jumped in different phases of this work. But if we think back to March 2020, and we think about the focus for this economic challenges groups, I understand is childcare and also small business and nonprofits, and really take a little bit of time as a team and in your subgroups to go back to who was it that was most affected? Who were you hearing from? Who did you maybe not hear from in your particular role, but that we've heard through from phase 1? about where those needs were and where for a lot of folks they still existed, right, over the last couple of years, with the goal of, is there a way to do some transformative change? Is there a way to use some of this ARPA funding to do something different, to do something new? And so when I say that, I also, as you get closer to your right, Susan, and I appreciate that direction, we're not going to have absolutely all the answers when folks get to present in May. And just stating that you're going to do this work that's been done differently because now you're going to, and I've heard this, utilize cultural brokers or incorporate cultural brokers, isn't really going to show us how. So it's not all the details, but I would just encourage you to really differentiate what the plans are from what's already out there, and be able to talk a little bit about how what's going to be different. So hopefully that's helpful, but you're right, there will be some time of the actual implementation. Thanks, everybody. Susan, can I ask a quick question? I just wanted to make sure that this group, did you already talk about the decision on the FRCs? Is everybody aware of that updated commitment?
About the funding going to the FRCs? No, we didn't talk about that.
Okay, and so I might just share that just because for when we talk about direct financial assistance, that might answer some questions for folks as well. And it may give you some ideas too about where you want to, from either numbers and or organizations, as you're talking about grants and selection committees, et cetera. The board did make a decision that's been being in the works, talked about for a little while, but our family resource centers, so the Our Center, EFA, and Sister Cardamom are all going to receive $250,000 during this process to do direct financial assistance, to look at operational expenses based on some of the updates that we received for the American Rescue Plan Act in the update on January 6th that changed some of the ability to use funding. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that, because I know there's been some other nonprofits that were on the ground in March 2020 with all of the different responses and addressing specific sectors of community that weren't at the forefront before that. So just want to share that because that might give you some things to think about as well. That's my last interruption.
Not an interruption. That's helpful.
And I see a hand up.
Julie.
But it's Julie. Good news. I hadn't heard that it had been improved, so it made my day. But just for the working groups, so Sister Carmen, Our Center, and EFA, we put together, and our view is this is like for immediate funding to keep doing while this bigger planning process is going on. So the three of us are orienting this to direct financial assistance in the normal lines we have, which is not childcare, for example. It's rent and utilities and that kind of thing. Food, critical food purchases for the food banks, and then some staff development and staffing stuff coming out of COVID. So just to give you an idea, we intend to have it spent within 2 years rather than like the longer timeline of this ARPA work. So I think it was to keep things going right now while the longer term planning kicks in.
Yeah, appreciate that. And also just want to share too that I was in a call with Congressman Neguse maybe 2 weeks ago now, and just what we're seeing nationally, his encouragement was to speedily expedite the use of those funds. Despite the fact that there is a longer timeline, there is some conversation about states having to give back their money if it hasn't been used. And so that puts us back into this conundrum of how do we do transformative change and how do we show that we're using the money to indicate that there is an immediate need. So not to toss too many challenges into the virtual room, but also want to share the information that I have too.
Great, thanks, Commissioner. So I think the last thing we wanted to talk about is just in a little bit more detail some of the next steps and kind of engagement of this group and the subgroups. And I know that several people have dropped off, so we've got a little bit of a smaller group right now. So as Rebecca talked about before, we have about a 5-week period right now, a little less, before we present to the commissioners. And there is detailed work we have to do, including providing the criteria list on next Friday. So we would just love to hear from people what kind of engagement you're able to give, or commitment you're able to give over the next 5 weeks. And to Johanna's point, there's no issue if this is kind of what you can do and that's it. I think we just want to get a picture of who could be involved in some of this more detailed work. The more input that we can get from the larger group and the subgroups, the better. The more involvement. And I think, again, to Rebecca's point, we really would love to have as much participation in presenting these ideas, the recommendations to the commissioners on the 3rd. So would love to have people, if you want to put it in the chat, if you're available to do that or not. Even if you're not available to participate in work or have more meetings over the next 5 weeks, our commitment to you is to continue to forward you any updates as we move along. If there are things that come up that we feel like are barriers to these ideas, we will continue to talk with you about them, and maybe even can get feedback through email. So, we know that in some ways we're still kind of in the middle of some of these ideas, and we know that there could be things that come up that shift the direction slightly. So with that said, just wondering if people have a sense right now, if they want to be involved the next 5 weeks, if they're available to be involved the next 5 weeks, and then also if there's an interest or availability in presenting on the 3rd of May. And involved can look like you're reviewing emails, or maybe there's a meeting. Maybe we have one more subgroup meeting. I think the child care group, I would be interested in maybe one more meeting with that group. So Debbie, I saw you unmute.
I did. Sorry, I've been not following directions. I was just going to say I'm happy to continue to help, and would love to be a part of the May 3rd piece too.
Same
Great.
here.
Jessica, thank you. Great, Jane, thank you so much. And Jane is a staff person helping to support. We've been lucky, both Shannon and Jane are really experts in some of the early childhood area. So we've brought them in to help with more of these details around some of the child care support. Thanks, Julie, appreciate it. And I already set up a meeting with Julie tomorrow to talk through Julie and EFA have really been piloting and spearheading a lot of this direct assistance and how to increase amounts to families and how to do it creatively and not have to deal with the cliff effect. So I'm going to pick her brain tomorrow a little bit as well. Great, Hayden, thank you. And thanks, Rachel. That's awesome. So, again, I think we will kind of regroup here, continue to reach out to you all, and I think maybe look for potentially another meeting, whether it's a subgroup or the larger group. I think the other thing we want to think through is we have to we're going to need to join our presentations together and work on that as a larger group. So we'll have some subgroup work and some of the larger group work together. That's all I have. Rebecca, anything else you'd want to add, or Johanna, you just came off mute?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and I think this group is already all over it, but if anyone needs any assistance setting up collaborative documents or anything like that, organizational things as you move away from these meetings and more into talking offline, happy to help with those. And everyone on the engagement team is also readily available to help.
Thanks so much.
I don't have anything else. I think we covered our agenda.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it, and just be looking for materials or another meeting invite from us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.